We're only a couple of weeks into 2024 and already the big game companies are showing off everything they have. We've got the Xbox Showcase in about a week's time, and down the track later this month, we're going to have the big Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 gameplay reveal. Hold on to your hats for that, because that is no doubt going to be quality. There's no way that game is going to be a huge mess. But for now, we'll look at Xbox, because the Xbox Showcase, it is going to give us more about Avowed, an RPG supposedly releasing this year from Obsidian Entertainment. And there's also going to be a big gameplay reveal for the Indiana Jones video game. So we'll look at that too. Those are the two main ones I am focused on. There's going to be some other games shown as well, but I don't care about them so much. So we'll focus on the heavy hitters. And as always, we have the announcement of the announcements. And Xbox say here, the show will be a big celebration of just a selection of our slate of upcoming games from Xbox. It's also another part of our commitment to consistently bringing Xbox players can't miss experiences. Now, I don't really care about Xbox as a brand at all. I play all their games on PC if they're worth playing, and to be honest, not many of them have been. I mean, Starfield was the latest supposed can't-miss experience, and they certainly lied about that, and that seems like it was a big failure for Xbox and Microsoft. They talk about player metrics, how many people entered the solar system, explored the galaxies, but how many people actually spent money to play Starfield? I don't think it was too many people. They spent $8 billion on Bethesda, and all they've got as a reward is to be laughed at. Redfall further destroyed their brand. They were probably thinking, okay, this was a big mistake, but Starfield's coming, that will make this all worth it, and that was really no better in the grand scheme of things. Sure, on paper it might not be as bad, but people were expecting it to be the next big Bethesda magnum opus, and it certainly wasn't. I don't think it's actually done anything for Microsoft. It's done no good even on the financial side. They've been very quiet about Game Pass subscription numbers, and they would have been expecting Starfield to absolutely blow things up. When Microsoft bought Bethesda, it just seems like their fortunes were going to change. They were going to get a bunch of big titles, whether it was a Fallout, an Elder Scrolls, Starfield, when we thought it was actually going to be something, and they might be must-plays. They'd lead people to subscribing to Game Pass, they'd lead to Xbox console sales. But because everything from them has been so mediocre, Game Pass subscriptions are stagnant, so are the console sales. There's even been rumors of perhaps Xbox just simply going third party. They can't rely on building their own ecosystem. They're going to have to continue to get their sales from Steam. They might even have to explore the PS5. So that's how bad Bethesda have been for them. And they simply haven't had these can't-miss experiences. When Xbox started to bring their games to PC day one, I was thinking, cool, I'm going to get more titles to play. So far, I feel like I've wasted my money. I bought Starfield day one. I even bought Halo Infinite. I thought, yeah, it might be an okay FPS. That was a bit of a letdown as well. And they go on to say 2024 kicked off with a bang for Game Pass members, and you can expect that lineup to include more incredible games from Xbox and our partners as the year goes on. I think they've said that every single year. Has there been a year from Xbox where they haven't said, this is the year where it's all going to happen, and then it's just the same old story? There's either no games, or they actually release them like they did last year, and they all suck. Every year, Phil and the team, they're determined to make us eat our words, but it just never quite happens, let's be real. They describe Avowed, which will be at this presentation on January 18th, depending on where you are in the world. And on Avowed, they say the team at Obsidian will share the first deep dive into the gameplay experience fans can expect in Avowed, their upcoming fantasy action RPG, set in the fantastical, vibrant, living lands, basically set in the Pillars of Eternity universe, the isometric CRPG series that they've been making as well. Learn more about how Obsidian's expertise in building worlds with deep themes. Interesting they say that given most of Obsidian's games have actually been based on existing game IPs, their strength has actually never really been building their own worlds. Sure, they did Pillars of Eternity. Was it really a massive seller? I think the first did pretty well, but I think that was more on hype rather than the game itself. They obviously had the big Kickstarter. It was a time when CRPGs were doing basically nothing. nothing, so everyone was desperate for some sort of old school RPG like this. It actually reminds me a bit of Double Fine, another Microsoft bought studio who were making one of the first genuine point-and-click adventures in a long time, at least in the somewhat mainstream. Everyone was pumped. I don't think that was that great. That was Broken Age, by the way. And Pillars of Eternity, kind of the same thing. It was the hype that brought people in, but when they finally played it, I don't think they thought it was the greatest game ever. It did get good reviews, but I think the reviewers weren't really CRPG players, so they didn't really know how to judge that correctly. And you can say I'm talking out of my ass, this is just an opinion. However, the second game did not sell well, and I think that is some sort of proof that people weren't absolutely gripped by the first game. If they were, they probably would have bought the sequel, such as with Divinity Original Sin 2, which sold a magnitude more than the first, suggesting that people actually wanted more of those games. They go on to say there's going to be dynamic gameplay and thoughtful reactivity come to life in Avowed, where players will have agency to make choices to shape every step of their adventure. Now, my prediction for what Avowed is going to be is basically the Outer Worlds with more of a Skyrim coat of paint, whereas the Outer Worlds was kind of what it is, but a Fallout coat of paint. And back when they probably started work on this game, that probably seemed like the right thing to do. Bethesda, they just haven't got it together. Elder Scrolls 6 is still years away. So why not Obsidian? Why not jump in and take a cut of that pie? They announced the Outer Worlds at the absolutely perfect time. People had had enough with, say, BioWare, with Anthem. I think Fallout 76 was announced around that time. So most of these RPG studios, the mainstream ones, were getting it wrong, and Obsidian swooped in. Now, I think the Outer Worlds is a solid enough game, but it just seemed to me like the big cheeses, the big wigs, probably at Obsidian and the publisher as well, they were just really worried about not making it accessible enough. Around that time, the RPGs to maybe look up to as mainstream successes, big sellers, were games like Mass Effect, which were essentially just action RPGs. They had choice, but in the gameplay department, it was often very simple. There were some systems, but you could easily get through it even on a normal world without really engaging with those systems all too much. You could almost just treat it like a shooter. It was really basic. The Outer Worlds just had this feeling like, hey, we're doing a few old school things, so you better like it. Let's forget about whether what we're actually doing is quality or not. We've got a Bethesda-like or a New Vegas-like dialogue system. Who cares about the quality of the actual writing? Who gives a toss if these send-ups of the corporate world are actually good quality or not, if they're actually funny? We've put them in there. There's some RPG choices, some stats, so it should be good for you guys, right? You should like it because it is a role-playing game. Well, I think players do have standards, and now that we've got games like Baldur's Gate 3, for instance, plenty of other indie titles, Disco Elysium as well, people expect a higher quality standard. And the priorities with Outer Worlds seem like we need to sell this to the masses, so idiots need to be able to enjoy it as well. And I'm not just talking about complex systems, you've got to have an Excel spreadsheet on your second monitor to be able to enjoy it. I'm just talking about a little bit of depth and having writing that doesn't feel like Hollywood movies, where they treat you like you're a little bit stupid, you're a little bit simple. And for me, at least, the Outer Worlds kind of felt like that. Because Avowed was greenlit under those conditions, I am a little bit concerned that it's going to be around these same lines. There's going to be a big focus on let's make it really accessible, let's make it more of an action game, and maybe some of the RPG stuff is going to take a back seat. Now, if we look at an older interview, this is really the only interview that Obsidian have done in detail on the game, and it came out around the time that we had the big gameplay trailer around 6 months ago for Avowed. I think it's worth revisiting because we do find out some juicy details, such as you can play as a human or an elf, but not other races. And that's a little bit concerning in an RPG like this, that there isn't going to be more choice in character creation. And sure, there's successful quality RPGs where you don't have a massive choice around who you are. Sometimes you're a preset character like Geralt in The Witcher. However, I think there's actually a difference there, because if they choose a preset character and a lot of work goes into them, that could be high quality development in its own right. But when they've gone to the trouble of actually making a character creator and there's barely any choice, well, then you're sort of getting the worst of both worlds. You're not getting a preset character with a quality history, a backstory, something to really sink your teeth into. You're just making your own, but you can barely choose who you are. I've seen some copers suggest that PC Gamer might have got this wrong. They misheard or didn't understand what they were saying correctly, but you would think that Obsidian would have corrected this if that was the case, and an amendment would have been made. It was the only interview to go out around that time. It's not like there were dozens, and someone just missed this. Obsidian obviously knew this was printed and did nothing. Now, this doesn't mean the game is going to be bad, but I don't think it's a really great start. It does mention it's purely single player, no co-op. I understand some people like co-op, but I do like when a game is designed around just one person purely playing, and everything goes into that, because that is how I generally like to play these games. They do mention that you'll have 2 companions with you at a time, with their own combat specialties and, of course, personalities. We'll see how we go. The Outer Worlds companions, they just weren't very memorable. New Vegas, for instance, I remember those characters a little bit more. Hopefully they can improve there, and the companions don't just look like Netflix employees who've been let out of the office for the day, because that's sort of how the Outer Worlds companions felt. They weren't too interesting. There are several ability trees to progress through, and you won't be locked to a particular class or playstyle. That's fine, as long as the combat, as long as the abilities are interesting. I think the problem, again, with making Outer Worlds so accessible is what tends to happen is you have these systems, these combat systems, but the game is just so easy that you don't really need to get into them too much. I kind of mentioned that earlier, and you could say, yeah, well, sure, play on a harder difficulty. If you play on normal, that's your own fault. But I do feel that, the game overall is going to be designed around that normal experience. Not all the devs are really going to care or put time into the harder difficulties, and that generally ends up meaning that hard modes, it's basically just enemies have more health and you take more damage. It's not super interesting. I'd like to see a bit more go into the combat systems, and maybe they are getting it right. I'm just sort of guessing based on the Outer Worlds and the fact that Avowed was announced around that time. They don't have, say, Baldur's Gate 3 as a reference point, and I'm really just using that example because it was so commercially successful, and I think it will tell devs that they don't have to dumb absolutely everything down to achieve success, to sell copies. They don't have to be scared. They don't have to treat players like they're stupid. There is a big audience out there who will buy a quality RPG, and if you just hamstring your own game because you're worried that idiots aren't going to buy it otherwise, then that's just your own fault. And if that happens to Avowed, it is going to be Obsidian's own fault. They mentioned lastly in this interview, you will level up, but the focus is on unlocking abilities rather than putting points into stats to grow stronger. And I assume that is part of this being an action RPG rather than being really stat focused, and it probably does also come back into wanting to make it accessible. That's what I would expect here. The problem Avowed has as well is the last big gameplay trailer, the only really one we've had, it just didn't really impress people. The presentation was kind of poor, and ever since that moment, Obsidian have basically backpedaled, and they've tried to temper expectations for players rather than build excitement. It's like the opposite of Cyberpunk, where CD Projekt Red were doing everything they possibly could to hype people up. And you could say that was at another end of the spectrum. That's bad as well, but at least people were excited for Cyberpunk. I don't feel that many people are excited about Avowed, because they originally, whether it was them pitching it or whether people just jumped on it and had their own expectations thrown on it, there was this feeling like it was going to be Obsidian's Skyrim, and Obsidian have now said that is absolutely not going to be the case. It's more going to be hubs, probably just like the Outer Worlds, and that's why I kind of feel the games are going to be very similar in style. One for Fallout, one for the Elder Scrolls in terms of tone. I understand it's not going to be a AAA game, but I think just the presentation, you're going to lose so many people if that's not there, and because Avowed look middling, it's not going to bring in people on the fence, whereas, again, Baldur's Gate 3, they put so much work into that presentation. I personally don't necessarily get heaps and heaps more enjoyment enjoyment out of the zooming in when it comes to cinematics or big story moments. Like in Baldur's Gate 3, you're not in sort of that isometric camera view when you talk to people. It's more like a modern AAA game, and Baldur's Gate 3 did that, and it is a big part of why people gravitated towards it. If they didn't do it, I would have still played it, but they wouldn't have sold 25 million copies plus, I am sure. I'd probably temper your expectations for Avowed. It might be okay, it might be solid, but given even Obsidian aren't getting people pumped about it, it's just going to be very surprising if it turns out to be an all-time classic. I'm hoping it does okay, it does enough that Microsoft still have confidence in Obsidian, and hopefully they give them the budget and the freedom to just make absolutely anything they want. They'll have no excuses. Running out of money like in the old days, I assume, isn't going to be a problem anymore with the Microsoft dollars, so they can show us we can make the game of our dreams, we can do anything we want, it can be this huge sprawling world. It's not going to be unfinished because some publisher forced us to rush it out within 12 months. All that will hopefully go away, and Obsidian can stand on their own 2 feet, and whatever they present, that's going to be the best that they can do. I don't think Avowed is going to be that, but the next game could be. Doesn't mean it'll be good. I think a lot of the best people from Obsidian have gone, but maybe they can at least present their best work with no strings attached, nothing hamstringing them, and we probably won't get that for some time. I do want to just touch on the Indiana Jones game as well. So they mention here Machine Games, the award-winning studio behind the recent Wolfenstein series. Now, I thought New Order and the Old Blood, they were solid enough shooters. I don't think they were amazing. I personally preferred Return to Castle Wolfenstein. Nostalgic game for me, but I think it still holds up to some extent. But the new Colossus, that game was just so garbage. It's not even all the little political messaging and everything that they threw in there. It was very much that there was no real level design. That was just horrible. They just didn't feel like interesting levels to explore. If I play, say, a Dark Souls, that's what I consider great modern level design for any sort of action-focused game. And I find that in, say, older Doom titles, the older Quake titles, many first-person shooters from the 90s, the early 2000s. The new Colossus had absolutely none of that. I thought it was totally atrocious, and I haven't been that hyped about their next game because of it. But Indiana Jones, there's some potential there. However, I think the very best Indiana Jones game was The Fate of Atlantis. I think it's the best Indiana Jones media of any kind since the original trilogy, and it's just a fantastic experience. Great story, great gameplay. It is a point-and-click adventure, say like Monkey Island, same developers actually, so I'm sure they can't do that in the AAA space these days, but I'm really hoping it's not just a purely action-focused title where you're just going from sort of dungeon to combat encounter, maybe some puzzles, and that's really it. I'd honestly love something similar to the Broken Sword games, but maybe with a bit more action packed in, given Indiana Jones does have that. I'm fine with some shootouts. I'm fine with some shenanigans in the dungeons, in the temples, and so on, but I'd love to also be talking to people, maybe solving some inventory puzzles like in point and clicks, but that's me totally coping. We know it's not going to be that. They go on to say they will reveal their upcoming Indiana Jones game, an action-adventure that puts players in the leather jacket of the legendary archaeologist. Developer Direct will showcase more than 10 minutes of game and developer insights, including details about the game's settings and story, how fans will actually play as Indy, additional details from his next globe-trotting adventure, and the premiere of the first gameplay trailer. So they're gonna really show it off, it sounds like, and there is a rumor going around that it is going to release earlier than expected. So anyone thinking, oh, it's gonna be 2025, they're just showing it now, I don't really think that's going to be the case. It has actually been, I think, around 5 years since the new Colossus, so it's been a while since they've released anything. They've had time on this. So 2024, it's realistic in terms of the dev cycle, and the rumors suggest it as well. Is it going to come out before Avowed? It seems like it could go either way. I think it's going to be one of these big games per quarter. It's not going to be like Avowed in June and then Indiana Jones in July. I'd be surprised. It's probably going to be, if I guess, I think the Indiana Jones game might actually be, say, May or June, and Avowed will probably be end of the year, like November. That's just my hunch, that's just my feeling, but I could be totally wrong. It could be interesting. Now, all that being said, this Indiana Jones game, it's technically another Bethesda title, so it's hard to get excited these days given the amount of stinkers that they've produced. Maybe this one will be better managed. I'm kind of on the fence, given Machine Games' last output. Indiana Jones in general, it's been so long since that franchise has had a win. Who knows? At least things can't really get much worse, given the latest movie. It may not be great, but I don't think it's going to do any more damage than has already been done. But we won't have to be guessing for long. In about a week, we're going to get these presentations, and we're probably going to get a much better idea if these are going to be games that you or I are going to enjoy. So thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.